Picture Manhattan without its steel giants piercing the clouds. Strip away every yellow cab, every flashing billboard, every concrete tower reaching toward the heavens. Now keep going. Dig deeper through time until you hit raw earth, ancient forests, and a coastline so pure it would make your heart ache. The year is 1660, and what you're looking at isn't New York at all. It's something far stranger, far more dangerous, and infinitely more fascinating. This is the birthplace of American capitalism, wrapped in Dutch brick and mortar, where the rules of the modern world were being written in real time by merchants who cared more about profit margins than about glory. 364 years before our time, the island the indigenous Lenape people called Mannahatta hosted a peculiar experiment. At its southernmost point, a cluster of buildings rose from the wilderness, their stepped gables and spinning windmills creating a surreal transplant of Amsterdam onto American soil. But this wasn't some romantic colonial fantasy. This was New Amsterdam, a corporate outpost run by the Dutch West India Company, where every decision came down to one brutal question: will this make us money? Today we're diving into the streets of this proto-metropolis, using reconstructions based on the legendary Castello Plan of 1660. And what we'll discover is that nearly everything you think defines New York today was already brewing in this muddy, chaotic, brilliant little town. Let's start where power lived and breathed. Fort Amsterdam crouches at the island's southern edge, like a watchdog guarding the harbor. Forget your romantic notions of European castles with soaring towers and gleaming banners. This structure was built for function, not fantasy. Earth ramparts reinforced with stone, cannon ports facing the water, and inside those walls, a cramped universe of conflicting interests. The man running the show was Peter Stuyvesant, and you need to understand something about him right away. He wasn't some noble explorer or idealistic pioneer. He was a company executive with a wooden leg reinforced by silver bands, and his job was simple: make this colony profitable, or answer to shareholders back in Amsterdam. Inside the fort, chaos had a system. Imagine walking through those gates and being hit by the stench of beaver pelts stacked to the ceiling. These furs weren't just cargo. They were liquid gold in 17th century Europe, where every fashionable gentleman needed a felt hat made from North American beaver. Clerks with ink-stained fingers scrambled to record every pelt, every transaction, every debt. Arguments exploded in a linguistic free-for-all. You'd hear French spoken by Huguenot refugees fleeing religious persecution, German from craftsmen seeking better wages, English from traders testing the waters, and of course the harsh, efficient Dutch of the ruling merchant class. This wasn't a colony in the traditional sense. It was a multinational corporation that happened to govern people. Just beyond the fort's shadow spreads an open common ground, the lungs of this cramped settlement. Later generations would formalize this space as Bowling Green, but in 1660 it served as the town's outdoor parliament, marketplace, and social hub rolled into one. Cattle changed hands here, gossip spread like wildfire, deals were struck and broken before noon. If you want to find the DNA of Wall Street, don't look at the banks. Look at this dusty patch of earth where profit and survival were the only gods that mattered. This was where ordinary colonists rubbed shoulders with company officials, where the price of bread or the threat of indigenous raids dominated conversation, where democracy existed not as a principle, but as a messy negotiation between people who needed each other to survive. Now we move along the eastern shoreline, following what the Dutch named Parelstraat, Pearl Street. The name tells you everything about this place. The coastline glittered with crushed oyster shells, and in the right light they looked like scattered gemstones. This is where New Amsterdam's winners lived, the merchants who'd cracked the code of transatlantic trade. Their houses would shock you if you're imagining primitive colonial shacks. These structures were architectural statements, narrow-fronted buildings rising 3 or 4 stories, their facades brilliant with imported brick in reds and yellows. Those stepped gables weren't decorative flourishes, they were status symbols, announcing that the owner had connections stretching back to Amsterdam itself. Here's what blows my mind about these merchant princes. They furnished their homes with treasures from literally every corner of the known world. Walk into someone like Cornelia Steenwick's residence, and you're stepping into a museum of global trade. Persian carpets cushion your feet. Chinese porcelain gleams from wooden shelves. Heavy ledgers bound in leather record transactions spanning continents. These weren't people playing at wealth. They were the original 1%, and their power came not from royal bloodlines, but from knowing which ships would arrive in which ports carrying which goods. In New Amsterdam, your family name meant nothing. Your network meant everything. But let's not kid ourselves about who this town really belonged to. The soul of New Amsterdam didn't live in merchant palaces. It thrived in the taverns that seems to occupy every third building. By the middle of the 17th century, visitors were already commenting, sometimes complaining, about the sheer density of drinking establishments. Why did this tiny settlement need so many places to get drunk? Because taverns weren't just about alcohol. They were the information highways of their time. Step into one of these establishments as daylight fades, and you're entering the real engine of colonial life. The atmosphere would overwhelm you immediately. Smoke from clay pipes hangs thick enough to slice. The smell of roasting meat and unwashed bodies creates a sensory assault. At one table, a ship captain recently arrived from Caribbean plantations describes sugar prices with the intensity of someone discussing life and death, because that's exactly what's at stake. Nearby, a German carpenter argues timber quality with a Dutch farmer who's just crossed from Long Island. A French jeweler examines a handful of wampum beads, trying to calculate their exchange rate against guilders. This is commerce as contact sport, and everyone's playing. What made New Amsterdam truly revolutionary wasn't its architecture or its location. It was the social experiment, happening inside those smoke-filled taverns and narrow streets. This settlement was practicing something the world had never quite seen before. Tolerance, not as a moral virtue, but as a business strategy. And honestly, that might be the most American thing imaginable. The defining moment came in 1654, when a group of Jewish refugees arrived by ship, exhausted and desperate after fleeing Portuguese persecution in Brazil. Stuyvesant took one look at them and wanted them gone immediately. He wrote furious letters back to Amsterdam, arguing that allowing Jews to stay would corrupt the colony's Christian character. But here's where the story gets interesting. The Dutch West India Company directors overruled him with brutal efficiency. Their logic wasn't about human rights or religious freedom in the way we understand those concepts today. Their calculation was simpler and colder. These refugees had capital, connections, and skills. Turning them away would be bad for business. And just like that, the precedent was set. New Amsterdam would accept anyone who could contribute to the bottom line, regardless of what god they prayed to in private. This wasn't the Enlightenment ideal of tolerance. This was mercenary pragmatism. And it worked spectacularly. The settlement became a magnet for everyone Europe was trying to expel or exploit. French Protestants escaping Catholic persecution. Africans, both enslaved and free, creating the first black community in what would become New York. Scandinavian traders. English merchants testing whether Dutch hospitality extended to their competitors. 18 different languages could be heard on these streets, and nobody particularly cared as long as everyone paid their debts and showed up when the town needed defending. This is the origin code of New York's famous multiculturalism, and it was written in ledger ink, not philosophical treatises. Look up toward the higher ground, and you'll see windmills turning lazily against the sky, their canvas sails catching the Atlantic breeze. These weren't quaint decorations transplanted from Dutch paintings. They were industrial infrastructure. The screech of wooden gears grinding grain into flour, the rhythmic thump of pumps moving water where it needed to go, the constant activity of sawmills cutting timber for the endless construction. New Amsterdam was loud with productivity, and the windmills were the heartbeat of that mechanical symphony. Everyone here was hustling, grinding, building, and scheming. Even the word hustle itself traces back to Dutch origins, which feels almost too perfect. These people didn't waste time on monuments to abstract ideals. They built what worked: warehouses, docks, workshops, and, most ingeniously, a canal. Run your finger down modern Broad Street on a map of Manhattan, and you're tracing what used to be water. The Dutch called it the Herengracht, and they carved it right through the center of town, so boats loaded with beaver pelts and grain could float directly to warehouse doors. Picture small vessels gliding between rows of brick houses, their cargo visible to anyone walking the banks, creating a working version of Venice, stripped of all romance and optimized entirely for logistics. This is the Dutch genius in a nutshell. Why haul goods through muddy streets when you can float them? Why waste human energy when water and wind can do the work? They were proto-capitalists, figuring out efficiency 300 years before business schools would formalize these concepts. But we can't tell this story honestly without acknowledging the darkness woven through all that prosperity. New Amsterdam ran on exploitation as much as innovation. At the bottom of this layered society were enslaved Africans, some brought directly from West Africa, others transferred from Dutch colonies in the Caribbean. Under Dutch law, many of these individuals existed in a strange category called half-freedom. They could own property, marry legally, and even testify in certain court cases, but they remained bound to work for the company whenever summoned. It was a cruel compromise that gave just enough liberty to be tantalizing, while maintaining all the essential controls of slavery. Some of the earliest documented black landowners in what would become New York held farms north of the settlement center, around the area we now call Greenwich Village. These farms served a dual purpose. They provided food for the growing town, and they created a buffer zone between Dutch settlers and the Lenape people whose land this had always been. The relationship with the Lenape was complex and ultimately tragic. The fur trade made fortunes for Dutch merchants, but every pelt represented deeper encroachment into indigenous territory. Tensions exploded into violence repeatedly. Raids, counter-raids, massacres, and fragile truces created a cycle of bloodshed that haunted the colony throughout its existence. This brings us to New Amsterdam's most famous defensive structure, though calling it famous might be generous. The wall was a palisade barrier, stretching from the East River to the Hudson, constructed from rough timber posts that could reach 12 feet in height. This wasn't a Roman fortification or a medieval castle wall. It was a desperate fence thrown up because the Dutch genuinely feared they might wake up to find themselves under attack. On one side of that wall, European civilization with its brick houses, windmills, and taverns. On the other side, wilderness, farms called boeries in Dutch, and the lands of the Lenape people, who watched this foreign settlement expand with growing alarm. The wall was patrolled by citizen soldiers, ordinary bakers and blacksmiths and merchants who took turns walking the perimeter with muskets, scanning the tree line for threats. The irony that makes historians smile is that this wall never stopped a land invasion. Its failure came from the sea. Picture this. It's 1664. just 4 years after the peak moment we've been exploring. The morning starts like any other in New Amsterdam. Merchants are haggling over prices. Ships are being loaded and unloaded at the docks. Tavern keepers are sweeping out last night's chaos. Then someone spots them. 4 English warships appearing in the harbor, like ghosts materializing from the morning mist. Their cannons are run out, aimed directly at the fort and the fragile collection of wooden and brick buildings that represent everything these colonists have built. Stuyvesant went ballistic. This was his moment. The old soldier with the silver-banded wooden leg wanted to fight, to load every cannon, to turn the fort into a fortress and make the English pay for every inch of ground. He probably imagined himself going down in history as the hero who defended New Amsterdam against impossible odds. But here's where the merchant mentality that built this place also sealed its fate. The town's leading citizens did what they always did when faced with a major decision. They calculated the costs. Fight the English and lose? The town burns. Their warehouses full of valuable goods go up in smoke. Their carefully constructed trade networks collapse. Their investments become worthless. Surrender and negotiate? They might keep their property, maintain their businesses, and possibly even benefit from English trade connections. When you've spent years building wealth through careful calculation rather than glorious gestures, the math becomes brutally simple. The merchants of New Amsterdam, the same people who'd turned this corporate outpost into a thriving port, now pressured their own governor to surrender without firing a shot. Stuyvesant signed the Articles of Surrender while probably cursing every merchant in town. The Dutch flag came down. The English flag went up. New Amsterdam became New York, renamed for the Duke of York, who'd been granted this territory by his brother, King Charles II. And just like that, 40 years of Dutch rule ended with signatures on paper, rather than blood in the streets. The wall that was supposed to protect the colony from invasion became irrelevant overnight. Eventually, it was torn down completely to allow the city to expand northward. But the path that ran alongside it remained. That path became a street. That street became the financial center of the world. Wall Street. Now here's what the English discovered when they took control. And this is crucial to understanding why New York became what it is. They inherited a machine they couldn't fully dismantle even if they'd wanted to. The Dutch had already encoded certain principles into this place, and those principles were too profitable to abandon. The new English rulers found a population that spoke multiple languages, practiced different religions, and conducted business with a ruthless efficiency that made everyone money. Try to impose strict English religious conformity, you'd lose half your tax base overnight. Try to restrict trade to only English merchants, the economy would collapse. So the English did something surprisingly smart. They adapted. They kept the Dutch tolerance for diversity, not because they were enlightened, but because they recognized a good system when they conquered one. New York, under English rule, remained unusually open compared to places like Puritan Boston or even Philadelphia. Sure, later laws would complicate religious freedom, and yes, English cultural dominance would gradually increase, but the fundamental DNA remained Dutch. Commerce over ideology, profit over purity, practical tolerance over theoretical principles. This is why New York has always felt different from other American cities. Boston was built by religious refugees, seeking to create a city on a hill, a beacon of Protestant virtue. Philadelphia was designed by Quakers, with their grid streets and civic planning. But New York? New York was raised by a corporation that cared about dividends. It was a startup that succeeded beyond anyone's wildest projections, and its success came from being willing to do business with anyone who had something to offer. Walk through Lower Manhattan today, and you're literally walking on top of New Amsterdam. Those narrow, crooked streets that frustrate city planners and confuse tourists, They follow Dutch property lines established in the 1600s. The way Manhattanites live stacked on top of each other in apartment buildings, that's an evolution of those narrow, tall Dutch houses, where every square foot of ground-level space was too valuable to waste. Even cultural touchstones Americans think of as purely their own often have Dutch roots. The word cookie comes from Dutch koekje. The modern image of Santa Claus? That evolved from Sinterklaas traditions the Dutch brought with them. But the real legacy runs deeper than linguistics or architecture. New Amsterdam solved a puzzle that cities around the world are still struggling with. How do you make diversity work? Their answer wasn't a philosophical breakthrough or a stirring declaration of universal human rights. Their answer was a deal, a transaction. If we can trade together and make money together, we can live together. Your private beliefs are your business as long as they don't interfere with our collective prosperity. It's cynical. It's pragmatic. It's not particularly inspiring. And it works. Rome was built on conquest, Paris on royal decree, London on imperial ambition. But New York? New York was built on a contract, a business arrangement between people who needed each other more than they needed to agree on anything else. That's the secret hiding in plain sight throughout this entire story. When you stand at Battery Park today, watching ferries cross the harbor, you're standing roughly where Fort Amsterdam once commanded the waterfront. Those tourists taking selfies with the Statue of Liberty in the background have no idea they're occupying ground zero of American capitalism. The frantic energy of the stock exchange, the immigrant stories written into every neighborhood, the aggressive hustle that defines this city's personality, all of it traces back to those Dutch merchants counting beaver pelts in 1660. New Amsterdam only existed for 40 years under that name, but those 4 decades encoded something permanent into the bedrock of this island. The lesson was simple and brutal and effective. Ideology divides, but money unites. You don't need people to love each other or even understand each other. You just need them to recognize that they're more profitable together than apart. It's not a romantic vision of human cooperation, but it might be the most honest one ever attempted. Think about what these Dutch merchants accomplished with that philosophy. They created the first truly global city in the Western Hemisphere, a place where someone from Amsterdam could do business with someone from Africa, while a Jewish refugee from Brazil negotiated with a French Protestant, all within sight of Lenape people trading furs. 364 years later, that same mix of cultures and languages and competing interests still defines New York, except now it happens in glass towers instead of wooden taverns. So here's the question worth asking as we close this circuit through 1660. Did the Dutch create New York, or did New York's inevitable future simply choose the Dutch as its vehicle? Maybe this island was always destined to become the unofficial capital of the world, and it just needed people ruthless and practical enough to kickstart the engine. Maybe diversity and commerce were always going to converge here at the mouth of the Hudson, and the stepped gables and windmills were just the opening act. New Amsterdam vanished from maps, but it never really disappeared. It lives in every deal struck, every immigrant arriving with nothing but ambition, every moment when profit mattered more than prejudice. The city changed its name, but it never changed its soul. And that soul was forged in mud and brick and beaver pelts by people who understood something the modern world is still learning. We don't have to agree to succeed together. We just have to be willing to make the deal.